This is Approaches revision. Approaches is in paper 2 alongside research methods and biopsychology. Paper 2 is 96 marks and 2 hours long. The approaches section is 24 marks. It should take you around 30 minutes. The key approaches given to us in the advanced information are learning approaches, which includes the behaviourist approach and social learning theory, the psychodynamic approach, and the humanistic approach. We'll start by looking at learning approaches. There are 2 learning approaches that we need to be aware of. The behaviourist approach. Within this, we need to be aware of classical conditioning, Pavlov's research, operant conditioning, types of reinforcement, and Skinner's research. The second learning approach we need to be aware of is social learning theory. Within this, we need to look at imitation, identification, modelling, vicarious reinforcement, the role of mediational processes, and Bandora's research. If we begin with the behaviourist approach, we'll look at the key assumptions of the approach to begin with. So, the behaviourist approach studies behaviour that can be observed and measured. Behaviourists try to maintain more control within their research and objectivity, so they use a lot of lab studies to achieve this. They're more scientific with their approach to psychology. They believe that all behaviour is learned. They described a baby's mind as a blank slate even, and they say that this slate is written on by experience, so whenever we experience something, it moulds us into the person that we are today. They suggest that the processes that govern learning are the same in all species, so that's like humans and animals all behave in the same way, and therefore they use animals as part of their experimental research. If we have a look at the first key point, so if we look, we need to be aware of classical conditioning and Pavlov's research, operant conditioning, types of reinforcement, and Skinner's research. So we'll start with the classical conditioning and Pavlov's research. I've got a little diagram here of Pavlov's research, just to make you aware of that. So if you want, when we've discussed Pavlov's research, you can draw it out as a diagram. You could pause this now and draw this diagram if you wish. You could transfer the diagram into words, but there's the diagram there if you want to pause that, have a look at it, or use it in the future. Okay, so we'll just go through classical conditioning. So classical conditioning is learning by association. It occurs when 2 stimuli are repeatedly paired together. So an unconditioned stimulus and a neutral stimulus, they become paired together after several learning experiences. The neutral stimulus eventually produces the same response that was first produced by the unconditioned stimulus. So we've been through classical conditioning quite a bit so far. We've looked at classical conditioning in terms of attachment already. We've also looked at classical conditioning in terms of phobias. So just make sure that when you're learning classical conditioning for approaches for paper 2, you're aware that you need to be describing Pavlov's research. Yes, you can elaborate further when you're evaluating, and you can use Little Albert to further support this idea of classical conditioning and show that it does also happen in humans. But when you're outlining classical conditioning in the approaches section, especially because in the advanced information, it tells us that you need to be aware of Pavlov's research, make sure that when you're describing classical conditioning in approaches, you support classical conditioning in approaches with Pavlov's research initially. And you describe Pavlov's research initially. If you want to elaborate further and bring in approaches, if you want to bring in the phobias, or if you want to bring in some classical conditioning from attachment as evaluation of the behaviourist approach, then that's fine. But initially, when you're describing it, make sure you just describe Pavlov's research. So I've mentioned Pavlov's research several times now, so let's just read through that. So Pavlov showed how dogs could be conditioned to salivate to the sound of a bell if that sound was repeatedly presented at the same time as they were given food. Pavlov's dogs learned to associate the sound of the bell, which was the neutral stimulus, which became the conditioned stimulus, with the food, which initially was the unconditioned stimulus, and they would produce the salivation response, which initially was an unconditioned response but became a conditioned response upon the sound of the bell. Pavlov was able to show how a neutral stimulus, the bell, can elicit a new learned response, a conditioned response, which was salivation, through association. So obviously, describing Pavlov's research there's a lot of words. So if you wanted to use the diagram, and you could put that diagram into the formula and the equation that we've discussed previously, you could use that to help you when you're revising. And you can use that to help you when you're writing it out in the exam as well. If you wanted in your plan, if it's an extended answer question, you could draw out the equation and then you can just elaborate on that equation, or you can even write the equation down in your answer and you can elaborate on that and make sure you describe what the neutral stimulus was. You explain that it had to be paired continuously in order to give that learned response. So make sure you use the key terms like neutral stimulus, conditioned stimulus, unconditioned response, conditioned response. So then we're going to have a look at operant conditioning. So operant conditioning was Skinner. I've got a diagram here, but you don't need to learn this diagram. It just kind of demonstrates what happened in Skinner's research for operant conditioning. This is a Skinner box. When the rat presses the lever, then a pellet will be dispensed and the rat will learn through reinforcement how to get food. Or it'll learn what to do when it gets the food. And that'll make sense in a moment. So, operant conditioning. A form of learning in which behaviour is shaped and maintained by its consequences. Possible consequences of a behaviour include reinforcement, which can be positive or negative, and punishment. So reinforcement, a consequence of a behaviour that increases the likelihood of that behaviour being repeated. It can be positive or it can be negative. I'll explain positive and negative reinforcement in a little bit. I go through them here. So Skinner's research is the example of operant conditioning. So for classical conditioning, you've got Pavlov. For operant conditioning, you've got Skinner. Skinner suggests that learning is an active process. In operant conditioning, behaviour is shaped by its consequences. These are the ways in which behaviour can be shaped. Positive reinforcement. This is receiving a reward when a certain behaviour is performed. For example, praise from a teacher for answering a question correctly in class. Negative reinforcement occurs when an animal or human avoids something unpleasant. The outcome is a positive experience. For example, when a student hands in an essay so as not to be told off, the avoidance of something unpleasant is the negative reinforcement. This links to the rats because a rat may learn through negative reinforcement that pressing a lever leads to avoidance of an electric shock. So avoiding something negative makes you feel better. So negative reinforcement is a way of learning because it makes you feel better, it gives you a positive experience. Punishment is an unpleasant consequence of behaviour. For example, being shouted at by the teacher for talking during a lesson. If you try to avoid that, that would be negative reinforcement. So negative reinforcement and punishment, make sure you know the difference between those, because they're the two that you might get confused about. Because negative, you think that means something bad, but actually it's avoiding something bad that makes you feel good in the end. We've got examples of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement from phobias also, but again, like I just mentioned, make sure you're just outlining the key terms, linking them to Skinner's research if it's an approaches question, and you can use the phobias stuff in evaluation if you wish to do so. Positive and negative reinforcement increase the likelihood that a behaviour will be repeated. Punishment decreases the likelihood that a behaviour will be repeated. So make sure you are aware of all of the key terms and you're aware of Skinner's research. So within Skinner's research, you've got this idea that he has the rat in the Skinner box, and through a series of different activities, so the rat would be rewarded for pressing the lever, because when the rat pressed the lever, it would receive a pellet of food. That would be positive reinforcement. The negative reinforcement, so there might be an electric shock going through the cage, and when the rat presses the lever, they would avoid getting that electric shock. So that would be negative reinforcement. So link the positive reinforcement and the negative reinforcement back to Skinner's research and Skinner's box. You should have a key study for Skinner's research, and in the workbook it asks you to, or the worksheet, to describe Skinner's research. So you can go into a little bit more detail about Skinner's research on that worksheet, and make sure you use your key study sheet to help fill that out. So the behaviourist approach, you've got the key assumptions, so everyone's a blank slate. Humans' behaviour is learned the same as animals. They use a scientific approach because they want to study things objectively. The key concepts are classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and then you've got your two key researchers, so your Pavlov for classical and your Skinner for operant. And then we've got evaluation. So let's have a little look at these. Strength. The behaviourist approach, it's well-controlled research, it's lab-based, so it uses highly controlled lab experiments. It breaks down behaviour into stimulus response units, removes extraneous variables, so we can establish cause and effect. Then you can link that back to Skinner's research. So behaviourist experiments have scientific credibility. They've got high levels of control. They're breaking it down to basic stimulus response, excluding extraneous variables, can establish cause and effect. However, the problem with this is that they may oversimplify the learning process. Because they reduce it down to simple components, they may ignore important influences on learning, such as the role of cognition. Other approaches, such as social learning theory and the cognitive approach, consider the mental processes involved in learning, suggesting that learning is more complex than behaviourism suggests. So if we look at that strength, that it's scientific, we can counteract it with that it's actually a little bit too reductionist, it's a little bit too simple, and then we can use a different approach to counteract that. If we use social learning theory there, that's good because that cuts down what we're revising, because we're using social learning theory to evaluate the behaviourist approach. And we need to learn social learning theory anyway. Second strength. The principles of conditioning have been applied to real-world behaviours and problems. For example, operant conditioning is the basis of token economy systems. These have been used in prisons. You've learnt this in forensics, so it's a really good one for us to use for revision. These work by rewarding appropriate behaviour with tokens that can be exchanged for privileges. So you've got that positive reinforcement there. Classical conditioning has also been used to develop treatments for phobias such as systematic desensitisation. If you wanted there, you could elaborate on systematic desensitisation a little bit. In the exam, if you're struggling, you could just describe systematic desensitisation if you can't remember or describe the token economy, because you've learnt systematic desensitisation in phobias anyway. This increases the value of the behaviourist approach because it has widespread application. So that's the strength. It applies to real world behaviours. Examples: operant conditioning, token economy; classical conditioning, systematic desensitisation. So we can apply it. It's really good. Finally, we have a limitation. The behaviourist approach sees all behaviour as conditioned by past experiences. Skinner suggests that everything we do is the sum of our reinforcement history. It ignores any influence of free will on our behaviour. So it ignores the influence of conscious decision making, as suggested by the cognitive approach, or if you wanted, you could also say ignores the influence of free will, as suggested by the humanistic approach, because we're learning the humanistic approach anyway, so you could counteract that with the humanistic approach. Okay, so there we've got the behaviourist approach, which is the first learning approach. Be really, really careful in the exam and look at the wording of the question. If it says learning approaches, you can talk about either the behaviourist or social learning theory. It might actually be a bit more specific and it might say the behaviourist approach, or it might say social learning theory. So just make sure you really read that question carefully. Let's have a look at social learning theory. So, the assumptions: people learn through observation and imitation of others. Social learning theory suggested that learning occurs directly through classical and operant conditioning, but also indirectly through vicarious reinforcement, mediational processes, and identification. So we're going to go through each of the key terms that is listed in the advanced information. So if you have a look there: imitation, identification, modelling, vicarious reinforcement, mediational processes, and we'll have a look at Bandora's research. So let's have a look at these. Vicarious reinforcement. This is when an individual observes the behaviour of others and imitation occurs if the behaviour is seen to be rewarded. So we've got that key term imitation there. The key term imitation is repeated throughout. An individual observes the behaviour of others and imitation occurs if the behaviour is seen to be rewarded rather than punished. Thus, the learner observes a behaviour, but most importantly, also observes the consequence of a behaviour. So vicarious reinforcement, we're looking to others and we're looking at the consequences of their behaviour before we decide whether we want to imitate that behaviour. If that behaviour is reinforced and if that behaviour it's a positive reinforcement, or it could even be negative reinforcement because you see that person avoids a negative consequence. then you are more likely to imitate that behaviour if they are rewarded for that behaviour. This links to mediational processes. So, social learning theory is a little bit more advanced or developed, I guess. It's a little less reductionist, a little bit more holistic than the behaviourist approach because it considers cognitive factors. It's sometimes described as the bridge between behaviourism and cognitive approach. It's kind of in the middle of those two, and it links those two together. And the key part that links them together is this idea of mediational processes. Social learning theory focuses on how mental cognitive factors are involved in learning. 4 mental or mediational processes in learning were identified by Bandura. 1. Attention, the extent to which we notice certain behaviours. 2. Retention, how well the behaviour is remembered. 3. Motor reproduction, the ability of the observer to perform the behaviour. 4. Motivation, the will to perform the behaviour, which is often determined by whether the behaviour was rewarded or punished. So the vicarious reinforcement bit probably comes in to that motivation bit at the end. So we observe whether that behaviour is rewarded or punished, and that gives us the motivation to imitate that behaviour. But if we're not paying attention to the behaviour initially, then we're not going to repeat that behaviour. So it can explain why sometimes people do not imitate the behaviour even though everybody is exposed to the same behaviours. In a classroom, for example. Another key bit here, observed behaviours may be stored by the observer and reproduced at a later time. So make sure you're aware of all of those mediational processes. In the worksheet, there's some example questions where you have an item and you have to link the item to the different parts of these mediational processes. Finally, we have identification. People are more likely to imitate people they identify with. The person they identify with is called a role model. And the process of imitating a role model is called modelling. Also, the behaviours that the role model shows or displays is also known as modelling. A person becomes a role model if they are seen to possess similar characteristics to the observer and or they are attractive and have high status. So if you identify with a role model, then you are more likely to imitate their behaviour. When it says similar characteristics, that could be they're a similar age, they're the same gender, they've had similar life experiences. All of these key things can make someone more relatable and make you identify with them. We have some evaluation here. Strength. Social learning theory recognises the importance of cognitive factors in learning, unlike the behaviourist approach. So like I said, it's kind of a little bit more developed than the behaviourist approach, a little bit less reductionist. This suggests that social learning theory provides a more comprehensive explanation of human learning by recognising the role of mediational processes. However, social learning theory has been criticised for making too little reference to the influence of biological factors on learning. Recent research suggests that observational learning may be the result of mirror neurons in the brain, which allow us to empathise with and imitate other people. This suggests that social learning may be an incomplete explanation of behaviour. So we're bringing in another approach to evaluate social learning theory. And it's really important when you are doing your revision that, especially in the approaches and the issues and debates section, you just learn a little bit extra just outside that advanced information, just the bits that you need to bump up your evaluation and just make that evaluation a little bit better. So for example, using a little bit of biology, a little bit of the biological approach to evaluate social learning theory, just to bump it up a bit and show that you understand how to evaluate approaches and you understand a wide range of approaches, just to make that answer a little bit better. Now we have a limitation. The evidence on which it is based was gathered through lab studies. So we'll have a look at Bandora's research in a minute. Many of Bandora's ideas were developed through observation of young children's behaviour in the lab. Participants may respond to demand characteristics in this situation, for example in the Berber doll research, because the main purpose of the doll is to strike it. The children were therefore behaving in a way that they thought was expected. This suggests that research may not explain how aggression is learnt in everyday life. So we'll just take a look actually at Bandora's research now. So I've got an image of his research, and if you wanted for a little bit of extra revision, you can have a look on YouTube and you can find videos of the experiment as well. So you can have a little look at that just to help you remember it, because you might remember something better if you can visualise it. If we have a little look, got procedure. Children observed aggressive or non-aggressive adult models and were then tested for imitative learning. There were two groups. Children saw an adult acting aggressively with the Berber doll, hitting it and shouting "pow," or children saw a non-aggressive model playing nicely with the Berber doll. Findings. Children in the aggressive condition were more likely to imitate the behaviour of the model than children in the non-aggressive condition. In a follow-up to this study, Bandora found that children who saw the model being rewarded for aggressive acts were more likely to imitate the aggression. This supports social learning theory, as it shows that children imitate role models and learn aggressive behaviour through vicarious reinforcement. They imitated the model more if they were rewarded. Okay, so make sure you're aware of Bandora's research. Use Bandora's research for evaluative purposes. You should have a key study sheet for Bandora's research, and there's space on the worksheet to outline the research also. So we've got a final evaluation point, which is a strength. Social learning theory principles have been applied to a range of real-world behaviours. Social learning theory can explain cultural differences in behaviour. For example, modelling, imitation, and reinforcement can account for how children learn from others around them, including the media, and this can explain how cultural norms are established. This increases the value of the approach as it can account for real-world behaviour. So we can use the approach in everyday life to explain how children learn behaviour. And you've got an example of that when you have looked at eating behaviours. In eating behaviours, you look at the role of the media and social learning theory when you are describing anorexia and the psychological explanations for anorexia. So you might want to bring in part of that to enhance your evaluation for social learning theory. Okay, so those are our learning approaches: behaviourist approach, social learning theory. Make sure you're aware of all of the key terms, the key research, and have a go at the exam questions. There's some application questions for these, and there are some questions that bring in a little bit of research methods. Because even though there's a whole research methods section on approaches, research methods could, on the paper 2, research methods could come up in the approaches section also. So you get double whammy with regards to research methods in that case. So have a go at those questions. And next we will look at the psychodynamic approach.